talk about the Diagram Center that a bunch of people have mentioned in the room so far. And because it is this big giant acronym, it stands for Digital and Graphic Resources for Accessible Materials. Okay, just so that everybody knows what Diagram stands for. And the reason we're here talking about it, that everyone has mentioned today, I think, is this is tough. It's a very big challenge. It's a challenge that what is the one real picture that I'm showing on the screen are a bunch of science-related images that are really complicated. They have lots of words in them, so they're not only just pure line drawings. They actually have letters and words in there which are really difficult for people with dyslexia, in addition to people who are blind. So this is why we're working on this, and with bunches of people in this room that I'll mention in a little while. What I'm going to talk about today, I'd love to say that Dave and others have outlined the problem really, really well, and we've got the solution. But the point about all of this is there isn't a solution. It's difficult. It's going to take everybody in this room working on this problem together to really come up with ways to address this. But what I'm going to talk about are 3 areas: tools, standards, and best practices. And these are really the focus areas, the Diagram Center, and the ways that we as a large collaborative group are addressing this really nasty problem. So I think what we're all also here about is something that I continue to say more and more. We need to make born digital mean born accessible. So there's not as much excuse going forward when things aren't on paper. When something's produced digitally, we should be able to make it accessible. And I think the image graphics and math areas are difficult, but not as difficult as something on a piece of paper. So I think I put this out as the reason why the time is now, and I'm in full agreement with my friend George, that the time really is now, and we have a lot of work to do quickly to make sure that we can realize this goal. To kind of lay that out a little bit more, part of our remit is to help content providers, like many people in this room, help students. And those content providers can be publishers, they can be accessible instructional material providers, they can be educators themselves. And the one that I don't actually have on the slide that I believe, and it came up in Sarah's presentation yesterday, these are content providers / publishers can be individuals. They are now also the students themselves. So this idea of we'll do the accessibility later just doesn't work. What are the kinds of things that these groups can provide that will help students? Image descriptions, we've talked a bit about that. Various access modes to images, including tactile graphics and other tactile formats. And of course, they need to provide timely access. If you provide all this great stuff 2 years after the kid had to take biology, it's not very helpful. So how does helping students actually also help the content providers? Well, this is kind of the cool thing. Dave and I are in great agreement on this because think about how much more discoverable your assets are if you have really good image descriptions. So I talk to publishers and others who have more and more large image asset databases, and it really helps to drive right down into that if you have it well described. It enriches these activities enrich the content for everyone, to Dave's point, but we also need to make sure that it's quicker, cheaper, and easier to produce this way than it has been. And of course, for a publisher, they have this reason they need to stay in business and make money, so you should be able to sell more books and sell more materials if you're more accessible. And I think by reaching all the students that's really possible. So let's jump into the Diagram Center. That's sort of the why are we doing this? The Diagram Center is a 5-year R&D center. It's funded by the Department of Education, the Office of Special Education Programs, and in fact our project officer, Glinda Hill, is here today. She was a big driver in recognizing that this area was critical to look at and critical to fund. Benetech is the lead organization, but we have 2 core partners. NCAM, you heard Sarah mention the National Center for Accessible Media out of WGBH yesterday, and also DAISY, the US Fund for DAISY, and George Kirscher, I'm going to cheat because I have a guy next to me with a microphone who's one of my partners. So when the hard questions come up, I'm going to say, hey George, let's maybe you could answer that. So I'm going to invite George actually at any point to give inputs because he's directly involved. Who else is the Diagram Center? It's not just these three groups. It's in fact, we have 27 member advisory board of technologists, educators, publishers, accessibility experts, students, parents, both higher ed and K-12. Just in this room or on this program alone, we have NFB, Google, Adobe, Pearson, Learning Ally, my friend Ed Summers from SAS who's about to get up, Dave Schleppenbach, Ron Stewart, even some of our international guests here, RNIB and Dorina Noel from Brazil are both involved in Diagram. And I already mentioned that our project officer is here. So I also have the benefit of not only coming after all these people have talked about some of these areas, but I have many of the people in the room involved. But the point is, it's a hard problem. So we have to have smart people involved. And some of you are not yet involved and you have something to add to this area, talk to me and I'll give you lots of ways to get a hold of us. We knew that an advisory board was nice, but we also needed to have working groups. And as John Gardner from View Plus said, he said, I don't want to be on the official little group that sits there. I want to be the people doing stuff. And so we have a math working group, again, focused both on the image part of math, the diagrams, but because, as Dave also pointed out, many equations when you read through a book say image, image, image. We decided we really ought to look at that as well. Tactile graphics, of course, and I guess I would broaden that, and you'll understand why in a minute, to say tactile representations. And a content model working group that I'll talk about in a few moments and that Matt Garish mentioned yesterday. I also mentioned briefly we have other collaborators outside the US, and we're going to continue to work with more groups on that vein. So what have we done? Let's talk a little bit about those three areas. A few of the things we've done are tools related, because we realize that we can talk about accessibility a lot, but if you don't actually provide tools for people, you can only go so far, or at least help with other tools others are doing. So there are three tool areas that we've already focused on. One is called Poet. So Benetech has developed a tool that I'll show you around crowdsourcing of image descriptions. There are a lot of images out there, and there are a lot of people that need to actually help describe them. So we wanted to have an inexpensive way to crowdsource all of those smart brains to come together and describe images. We've also, in conjunction with that, developed an image accessibility coverage checker for DAISY books. And I know that's one of your interest areas about checkers. Well, this is the image part of it. It's not the whole thing that we need to get to, but it's a start. And George mentioned earlier today the work on Toby from DAISY, which has been part of the Diagram project. So I'll talk a little bit about Poet. It is web-based, and as with everything out of the Diagram Center project, open source. So one of the other things we knew we needed to do were to sort of provide tools and get out of the way at some point. And if a publisher wants to take Poet and say, we want to bring it in-house and do some things to it and make image descriptions, that's great, because we just want you to be able to make good image descriptions. So this is for use by an individual author, publishers, and the whole range of accessibility providers out there. And the idea is to be able to quickly identify the images in a book, kind of look at the ones that aren't maybe needing description. So if you have a physics book and it's a photograph of Albert Einstein, and it already has a caption that says, photograph of Albert Einstein, I'm not sure that it's super educationally relevant to describe that further, and we also don't want to waste students' time. That was one of the huge inputs of our whole advisory board was, we really also need to keep the student in mind at every turn. Poet also allows you to author and edit these descriptions and provide guidance to the describers. So this came up a little bit in Sarah's presentation yesterday. NCAM, Learning Ally, AFB, and other groups worked on a project to sort of help say, what are good image descriptions? And I know this question came up a little earlier today. I think there's a lot more work to be done on that, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but we really did want to make sure that we didn't just say, oh, here, put image descriptions in, and then not give anybody any guidelines about how to do that. The other piece is then to be able to moderate and approve them. One of my favorite stories is this, is we were thinking a crowd are people like volunteers at Learning Ally or Bookshare, which that's true, that is part of the target group of a tool like Poet. But we also continue to hear, and I think Michelle mentioned this earlier, there are a lot of people, even inside a publisher, who need to have input on any editorial piece, and image descriptions would be included. So we're also starting to talk to more people who are saying, yeah, in my organization, I have 8 people that need to go through, and we need to be able to update image descriptions. So that was also one of the areas we looked at. And finally, we want to make sure that this is available not just to be a standalone web tool, but to be integrated into other production tools. So it's great if somebody has a web-based tool, but if they're using InDesign, it's really great if we can work with Adobe to make sure that there's some of this work integrated into InDesign. So we don't have enough time to do a full demo, but I at least want to pop over, and I'm going to just describe what's on screen. And this actually, I am logged into the Poet tool. It's a web-based tool, as I said. On the left, there's a column that pulls out all the images in the book. So it's bringing up every image, and it gives you a chance to go through and say, should this image be described? As I mentioned, the photograph of Albert Einstein example, and you can say unspecified, because I'm not really sure, or yes or no. And that means that as you go through the workflow, you can start to say, okay, I'm going to have my top expert only go through and describe the images that say yes, and then I'm going to have another person kind of editorialize and describe or think about the ones that are unspecified. You can also use this panel on the left to jump around to the images in the book, and on the right you see a larger panel that includes images and the text. So certainly we don't expect to just pull up a bunch of images and say, describe this, because you also need to understand the context. So that's just a quick glimpse. I don't want to get too bogged down into this, but we're always happy to give people a demo of the Poet tool, and happy to talk about this afterwards as well.
What is the primary difference between web accessibility validation and correction tool and this?
The question was, what's the primary difference between a web accessibility, validation, and correction tool in this? This is really designed for really specifically adding image descriptions, full image descriptions, and we'll talk about the content model in a moment, where they don't exist, or where they exist and they need to be edited. So, I'm sorry? Yeah, let's. I've been asked to sort of leave the questions to the end because we might touch on some of them as we go. But yeah, this is a pretty different application. Hop back over here. One of the use cases that this little group Bookshare that I know well likes to be able to do image descriptions as well. So one of the things that we built in was to make sure that we had a big test bed. And the test bed for Poet has been using hundreds of Bookshare volunteers to use Poet to add image descriptions to textbooks. There have been thousands of images described and given a lot of input back to the development side to say, here are the things that people need as they're actually using this tool, including, I will say, making sure that it's fully accessible. So there's some other really interesting groups that we're talking to where we like to bring in as, shall we say, a human check for the validity of the use of the image descriptions, people who are blind, who would be the actual users, who can then use the tool to go in and say, you know what, I need to fix this. So let's talk about standards. That's a little bit about the tools that we've worked on. On the standard side, George, Matt, Marcus, who are all involved, all mentioned the diagram content model. I'm going to go through that really briefly. So the content model's been one piece of it, and the other piece has been advocacy. So there's been some tense moments with everybody from the W3C to the Watch Working Group under HTML5 because the long description was pulled out of HTML5, and I felt like we were running after the bus as it was pulling out, saying, no, wait, come back, really, we really want to see it on this bus. And it's not been all that successful, frankly, to date. So we're still hopeful, but we are also, as several people have mentioned, looking at EPUB:"described at," and Arya Colon described at as ways to be able to have a real long description within all of the content that we're talking about. And I'm going to go through a little bit more, and I'm going to ask George to add some input to the content model because he's been very, very involved. This is an XML data model for image metadata. So this is, what is it that an accessible image is like? For a given image, you can have multiple types of descriptions. So short description, long description, simplified description for someone with intellectual disabilities, which, like many things we've talked about today, also we keep hearing is quite useful for someone, say, who's an 8th grader trying to look at some 10th grade material. So very useful for lots of people. Alternative image links. So if there is an SVG out there that can then be produced as a tactile, we want to make sure there's a link to it from this same image. And other image metadata is important, like the target age and that sort of data. One of the examples we often use, I have on the screen this ridiculously complex picture of the hydrologic cycle. And I have another view of this, really, that incorporates the content model that I just mentioned. So it talks about the author, the age, the target age and grade. There is a summary description which says the image depicts the cycle of water evaporating, turning into clouds, falling back to earth in the form of precipitation, and being filtered through sediment. There is a much longer description that I won't read through, and then we even have a room there for an annotation by a teacher. So a teacher could say, in the winter, we get snow instead of rain. Simplified language description, link to a tactile image, and even a simplified image. And I think one of the areas with the tactiles that we're also very concerned about is making sure that there's a tour for the tactiles so that you actually can work your way around the tactile graphic. And I'm wondering, George, do you have any additional comments that you'd like to make on the content model?
Well, we think that there's a variety of different elements in books that could benefit from elaboration, description, objects, complex tables could benefit, and we would like to be able to hang a described at pointer on all kinds of different things. And we think the content model is fairly simple and fairly complete, and it could be updated and modified in the future. But this is what we're working on, and it's been stable for quite a while. And it's incorporated into the Toby tool as well, and then the Poet. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we are out there to the many points made earlier about you need the whole flow, you need all sides of this equation. So we've been talking to content providers as well as to providers of tools to say, please incorporate this. As you're getting into your new EPUB 3 work, make sure that you leave room to support this content model.
And these kinds of extended descriptions we don't think are what most people would want to see in their book. And so the link outside the book, and it could be in the package that's downloaded, if it was a downloadable package, would be there, but most people wouldn't want to see it. And the described app would provide a reading system with an opportunity to, for example, pop this kind of information up and then go away. And we've heard in discussions at W3C that it's not just for blind people, that there's a lot of people who would benefit from extended descriptions of things that are in books.
Absolutely. I'm going to keep clipping along here because I know we're running a little short on time. The other area that I mentioned is best practices in research. So you have tools, you have standards that support those tools, and you also need to make sure that people know how to use all this stuff and really kind of know the state of the industry and the state of play. I mentioned image description guidelines, so we are certainly providing training on those image description guidelines actively. Product evaluation matrices, I have links in this presentation which I know will be provided, and I also have here to diagramcenter.org, which is the diagram website, and all of these things can be found there. Product evaluation matrices are continually being updated for both production tools and reading tools to talk about how well do these tools handle all of this stuff today. It's a sad story in some areas, but it's getting happier as we move forward. But we want to make sure that both commercial reading tools, for example, as well as specialized assistive reading devices are covered, and then on the production side, various production tools. So what's next? This is the stuff I talked about are things that we've been doing and things that we've been working on. There is a lot more to come. Diagram is a 5-year project, and we've just finished the 2nd year. So we are looking ahead. In POET, George just mentioned content model support. That literally, as we speak, is about to be launched. It's being worked on right now. And support for EPUB 3, because right now it supports doing work on image descriptions in DAISY books, which I'm going to guess, as I look at our friends in the publishing industry, they're probably not doing a lot of their work in DAISY 3. So we want to make sure we support EPUB 3 in these tools as well. Continue to improve the UI. MathML support, so making sure that you can actually look at these things that are image equations and support some MathML input and updating, and we'll talk a lot more about that as we get closer. And more STEM support, just making sure that guidelines and everything that are right there to make it really easy to use. I mentioned the image accessibility coverage checker for EPUB 3, so this, again, you can link to the current version on the DAISY side, so this will then move into the EPUB 3 side, that is essentially going to be looking for, are there some of these content model elements filled in? Are there image descriptions anywhere here? Prototypes, so there's other prototype tools that are being worked on now. There's an automated image description and tactographic decision tree. Lucia Hasty, working with Vanna, had done a decision tree about when do you do a tactographic. Well, that's being updated and in work with Smith Kettlewell and with Steve Landau, Touch Graphics, looking at how to automate that so that, again, you can have a describer spending less time kind of figuring out what to describe. QR codes for tactile annotation, so when you have a tactographic, actually having one of those cool little square QR code readers on there that could read out a description. Simplified math notation system is what Dave just talked about, so we're happy to be working with Dave on that. And there will be much more to come. We knew when we did Diagram that we couldn't just say we propose to do these things over 5 years because we knew things would keep changing. We also knew we had to actually pull other smart people in to do projects. And that's reflected in this work. And of course, we're just going to keep doing field testing of all of these tools and make sure that when they actually get in the hands of a student, a teacher, a publisher, et cetera, that they work. On the standard side, EPUB 3 accessibility is, of course, huge in this area, and we continue to collaborate on that. We will help in any way that Matt needs us to help update the Accessible EPUB 3 publication, and he is planning on an update that will include all of this content model stuff we just talked about. Continued advocacy and monitoring progress. So part of our job, we think, is to sort of do this and come out and talk to people and make sure that everybody knows what's out there, what's available, and what needs to be done. Reference implementation, so it's great to come up with tools. It helps if somebody implements something that you can show. And then exploring integration opportunities with other standards. We're talking actively with people about APIP and IMS and the areas around assessments and all the images in assessments, among others. Best practices and research. Some of our other subcontracts working with the National Braille Press on looking at 3D printers. For those of you who haven't seen them, they're very cool, and having commercial devices whose price is going down every month that can actually pop out a 3D tactile representation is a pretty cool idea. So we're looking at those. Looking at more usability of audio tactiles and text tactiles. Doing a collaboration with another OSEP-funded project called Metric, which is the Mathematics eText Research Center, to actually see how well math descriptions work in classrooms. Okay. Doing interviews with content providers. So again, we want to make sure that what we're doing helps you folks in the audience to provide accessible materials, because that's the goal. And then finally, what are the end users saying about this? Does it work? What's still needed? Where do we go from here? So where do we go from here? Well, we want to look at things, further work on tactiles. We want to look at haptics more, and you're going to hear some cool stuff from Ed in a minute. Low-cost refreshable displays. This stuff's still too expensive, and where it intersects with images and graphics, we love to make sure that all of this works together and is less expensive. interactives and manipulation, image exploration. I think there are a bunch of areas. And the good news is that next week, we have a bunch of these great people together to talk about this. We're having a 2-day offsite of all of our advisors and working group members to say, where do we go from here? And it's, so if you hear little explosions out from California, you'll know it's all of us talking about this topic. Finally, how can you get involved? So if you're not already involved, please, you can follow Diagram on Twitter at @DiagramC. You can pilot diagram tools if I know there are definitely some higher education institutions here. You can advocate to standards bodies. You can join a working group. You can get updates and spread the word. And you can contact us at info@diagramcenter.org so that we make Born Digital mean Born Accessible. Thanks.
We have enough